Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another program from the Health Ministries Department at Kansas Avenue Church, supporting a healthy lifestyle. So sorry for the delay. We're having some technical difficulties, so we'll get started and see how it goes. Um, so I wanted to just say, this weekend at our church, we have been doing programming on mental health. So yesterday we had Dr. Columbus Baptiste and our wonderful host, Guillermo Henry, who presented on racial disparities, stress, and our resiliency. That was a wonderful program that we had yesterday. Find it on YouTube, Facebook. As a matter of fact, I'll take the opportunity to remind you to share, like, and subscribe these programs. They're so helpful. So Dr. Batiste talked a lot on the racial disparities and our stress levels. And he gave a lot of tips on what we can do to increase our resiliency from our exercise, how we eat, those 7 laws. So to understand more about those 7 laws, you'll have to go back and click on the YouTube or the Facebook programming to refresh your memories on those 7 laws of health. I might be mixing that up with actually from the Heart Association, their recommendations, but still yet, there are wonderful laws of our health to keep us stress-free or to help us manage our stress better. So today we'll be hearing from Dr. Olango, and he will be talking more to us about mental health. So let me start here. Let's go ahead and pray while we wait for our technical difficulties to be resolved. Father God, thank you so much for everything that you do for us, for providing us knowledge, care, and your comforting arms. Please be with our program, resolve our technical difficulties for us, be with Dr. Olango as he presents. In Jesus' name I pray. And also, Father God, please bless everyone who's tuned in for these programs. Please bless them in their mental health and in the stress of their lives. Help us and them to remember all the things that you would have us do. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. And so let me start by going ahead and reading his bio. And don't forget, folks, to put your comments in the chat, put your questions in the chat, and hopefully towards the end of the program, we'll be able to answer those for you. So let's hear about Dr. John Olango. Now, he has a lot of degrees. He's fabulous. He has had so much education and could probably talk about most things. So he first received his Bachelor of Arts degree in theology with a health emphasis from Andrews University. He has a Bachelor's of Science degree in zoology from Andrews University. And he received a Master's of Science in biology from Walla Walla College. He later received a Master's of Arts in biomedical ethics and then a PhD in microbiology and molecular genetics from Loma Linda University. And then he received his Doctorate of Medicine, also from Loma Linda University. And then he completed his residency training in psychiatry at UCLA Kern, and then completed a fellowship in child and adolescent psychiatry. He is double board certified in general psychiatry and child and adolescent psychiatry. Dr. Olango is the program director of the UCLA Kern Medical Center Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Fellowship Program. He is involved in teaching medical students, resident doctors in training, and doctors in the UCLA Kern Child and Adolescent Fellowship and the General Psychiatry Program. He is the research director. Sorry, I just lost my place. He is the research director for the Kern Medical Psychiatry Department. He also teaches in the crisis intervention training, where he teaches psychopharmacology to cadets and veterans in the Sheriff's Department and Bakersfield Police Department. He also taught psychopharmacology to psychology doctoral interns. He is the Graduate Medical Education Committee Wellness Director for Kern Medical, where he coordinates wellness initiatives for doctors in training, faculty staff, and employees. He is the past chair of the Credentialing Committee, a subcommittee to the Medical Executive Committee. He is the current president of the Medical Executive Committee at Kern Medical. He became the medical director for the Kern County Behavioral Health and Recovery Services. One of his passions is involved in improving the quality of care provided to the community. He works closely with the Kern Juvenile Probation Services team, whose goals are assisting people with mental illness and addictions recovery and achieving hope, healing, and a meaningful life in the community. He has been regularly invited to speak at community programs, events, and churches throughout Southern California, where he presents a message of healing and recovery. He is married to Dr. John Olango, who is an OBGYN, and they have 2 sons. He is currently an elder and the minister of music at the Southside Seventh-day Adventist Church. Isn't that wonderful? He comes with so many qualifications there. So we are still experiencing some technical difficulties. So I wanted to read a verse from the Bible. Here, let me find it. I found it this morning when I was looking for something else, and I couldn't believe it. It's coming out of the Message Bible, Romans 13:14. It says, "Get out of bed and get dressed. Don't loiter and linger, waiting until the very last minute. Dress yourselves in Christ and be up and about." I thought that was fabulous. Sunday mornings, you kind of want to sleep in, but there's so many things to do. You know how it is. You have the kids to get dressed, meals to prepare, you're getting ready for the week ahead. And I saw this verse and I thought, oh my word, I need to post this on the wall. It is talking to our mental health. There's so many verses in the Bible that helps us and encourage us, because God knew how stressful our lives will be. And so all these little gems are throughout the Bible. So I will be right back. I'm going to go ahead and check and see how everything is going. And then I'll come right back. Thank you so much, everyone, for hanging in with us. Thank you, Victoria Ogun. It's great to see you here with us, And don't forget to put in your questions, your comments, your encouragements, so that we're able to read those and answer those questions towards the end of the broadcast. So I'll be right back and see how everything is going. Well, that was quick. So here is Dr. Olango.
All right, then. Hello, good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you. I think we had several difficulties over the previous hours. I think, welcome to real life, I guess. We're never without stresses and trials, and which makes the presentation this morning quite apropos. Thank you so much for that, a very kind introduction. And I want to also thank the pastor who has been with me working through technical difficulties, and also Nirma, who has been reaching out for this to happen. I think that as we proceed through the topic this morning, I'll be definitely open to questions as we go along. And there is a slideshow that I'd like to also share with you, but I can also continue without the slideshow because I feel that discussion sometimes is more meaningful than looking at pictures, even though they say 1,000 words, not always. Jeanette, do I just proceed? Is that okay?
Sure, go ahead. I've already introduced you, so you are good to go.
Okay, so I'd like to start off by saying that the whole topic of mental health can be looked at in very many different ways. I think what I heard is that was it Dr. Columbus yesterday who who spoke about I refer to it as JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, in terms of mental health, and that actually at some level can point to a system-based approach to mental health. In other words, for the entire county, when we look at it, are there mental health access points in all areas of the county? Is everyone able to get the necessary insurance to have mental health? Do the formularies that carry the medications for those individuals on those mental health plans, do they cover the range of medications that are considered to be efficacious or effective in treating mental health? Is there enough in terms of understanding cultural differences to reach out to those individuals who may have a different view of mental health as well? So that's one aspect of looking at mental health. Another aspect of looking at mental health is to look at it from a sort of the interaction of the, I use the word patient and the system. In that particular office, do they understand what's going on with them? Do they have the family support necessary? Do they understand the medications that they're taking? And then another way of looking at it, which is very important, will be also from, and I'll address all of these as we go along. Another way of looking at it would be from the point of view of family members who are dealing with individuals who have mental health crises. So now I'm going to stick kind of to this PowerPoint presentation, and I'll have to say that it's been adapted, not fully, because some of the changes were not saved, from the presentation that I present to the Sheriff's Department here in Kern County. For the last 4 years, I've been presenting 3 times a year to veterans in the Sheriff's Department and to their cadets, discussing what they refer to as crisis intervention training, and somehow trying to help law enforcement and responders understand what how mental health presents and how to better bridge the gap so that we can have more safe and less concerning outcomes when individuals need the emergency help. So today we'll talk a little bit about the role of medication in terms of mental illness. We'll become familiar with some of the general principles in treating mental illness. And we want to also understand some of the various situations that occur in the field. And when I say in the field, we're also referring to situations like when there's a mental health crisis in the home. And what do we do? We'll talk a little bit about medication trials. So this is when someone's being started on medication titration. And this is when, let's say, somebody has been diagnosed with depression, and they're started on a medication. Let's say the medication is SSRI, which means a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. You may have heard of the medication Prozac. So they're started on Prozac. And when they're started on Prozac, it may take about 2 weeks for the medication to actually start to work. And so when we talk about titration, the dosage that we start someone on, for example, if we're starting a minor or a child on that medication, we'd start on a very low dose, like 10 milligrams, and observe. But then also when someone started on a medication, there's some things that may happen that they may not be anticipating. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So we'll talk about, as on the previous slide, we'll talk about medication side effects. We'll talk about how it's like to be off meds, drug-drug interactions, and we'll become familiar with some new terms and concepts. So the aim, however, is not to either know necessarily the names of the medications, but just to become familiar with mental health as a whole, how it presents, what we can do for interventions, and possibly where to turn when we need the help. Please, though, it's very important that you ask questions as we go along. So I think it's important to look at some of the lifetime prevalence data. So when we talk about lifetime prevalence, we talk about in the course of someone's lifetime, from the cradle to the grave, for an entire population, what's the likelihood of somebody having a mental illness? And the lifetime prevalence for any population is about 50%. So that means that in the course of everyone's lifetime, at least 1 out of every 2 people is going to have a mental illness. It does not necessarily mean that this mental illness is going to be diagnosed and formally treated. As we'll discuss, a lot of mental illnesses actually fly under the radar, and people struggle in silence for a lifetime with it. It's also important for us to know that as we go to the next slide, that the prevalence of mental illness actually varies with age. So you can see, generally speaking, that between males and females, it's about 50-50, more or less an equal split. But then as individuals increase in age, the likelihood of having a mental illness goes up. We can go to the next slide. So in terms of mental illnesses, how are they divided? The most prevalent mental illness is an anxiety disorder. An anxiety disorder could be generalized anxiety. It can be specific. You can also include specific phobias. It also used to include post-traumatic stress disorder, not necessarily now anymore. It can include social anxiety, and so anxiety disorders are the most common. Then mood disorders, and when we talk about mood disorders, we're talking about situations like bipolar disorder. We're talking about depression. We're talking about, we're talking about something that's not quite as severe as depression, but is very long going, and that's called dysthymia. Then we also can move on to impulse disorders, and this is where we have ADHD. And for an ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and also in impulse disorders, we have intermittent explosive disorder. Substance use disorder can includes anything from smoking to alcohol, any substances that are not prescribed that cause some sort of dependence are there. And then any disorder altogether, 46.4%. So really we're saying that if we're looking at the entire population, we would see a high prevalence of anxiety, a high prevalence of a major depressive disorder, maybe. And then, of course, we'll have substance use disorders, and then a very small part of the population may have what is referred to as a psychotic disorder. So, as many as 450 million people suffer from mental illness or behavioral disorder, and 1 million people, and this is where it's really very, very sad, commit suicide every year. I'll take the time right now to point out that when it comes to individuals who take their own lives, there are warning signs that we probably need to be looking out for. When somebody becomes more withdrawn, someone begins to give away their things, someone starts to demonstrate signs of depression, we can become very, very concerned if there's been a recent loss or a suicide in the family or a friend. Suicide is more, individuals are more at risk if they're male, if they're older in age. Typically, suicide is also very much a concern if someone also has a comorbid, that means they also have a mental illness in which you can see increases in suicide, like, for example, depression or sometimes psychotic disorder, whether if they've been exposed to psychosocial stresses like bullying or loss, or even the loss of a loved one. All of these things can be risk factors for suicide. And typically, the warning signs, they are there, but sometimes they're only noticeable retrospectively. But when we look forward at them, we can see that oftentimes somebody will either confide with a family member or their primary health provider. So I think we should always, when we're interacting with loved ones, and see that they're particularly low or demonstrating any of the signs that we talked about, screen them and ask them, are you thinking about hurting yourself? Has this crossed your mind? Have you ever had an attempt in the past? And most times people are quite forthright in talking about it. 4 of the 6 leading causes of years lived on disability are due to mental illness, due to neuropsychiatric disorders, for example, depression, alcohol use, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. So as we proceed through the slideshow, I'd like to point your attention to the fact that 1 in 4 families has at least one member with a mental disorder. And so I think one way for us to bring this home is, like, if we're sitting in a congregation, let's say in the church is full, that would mean at least a quarter of the church is dealing with a family member who has a mental disorder. It means that if you're looking at the entire congregation, it means half of the congregation at one point in their life is going to deal with a personal mental illness. So in other words, what we're saying is that there's no individual in the congregation who is untouched by either having a mental illness or having to support somebody with a mental illness. And I think one of the biggest challenges, and I'll speak to this from not only from a clinical point of view, but from the point of view of someone who's involved in the church, is that there are very many different views about what mental illness is in the church. And I think some of the views actually keep individuals from getting the help they need. So this is where I somewhat diverge away from the presentation as it is to make it quite a little bit more relevant to us now. And why do I say that? The individuals who don't actually believe that there is any such thing as mental illness and believe that it might be just a lack of faith. And I think that we need to be very understanding with these individuals. But I do feel that we do need to give support to those who do have mental illnesses and remove the stigma, because a lot of times individuals will not seek help because they believe that somehow it's their fault why they're suffering or why an individual in their family is suffering. Sometimes there's a lot of hesitance to even receive any treatment, to receive counseling, or to even have treatment with medications, because again, it's thought that this is something that is unfortunately due to a lack of spirituality or a lack of trust. And I just like to kind of encourage us in the fact that mental illness, like any illness, um, um, is something that is very serious and can be treated. And in addition to that, not only is it serious and can be treated, but it's also important not to blame the individual for the illness. It's not a weakness on their part. In the same way, if someone has congestive heart failure, someone has diabetes, if someone has hypertension, there may be some lifestyle changes they may have, but it's not necessarily their fault. And so I think we need to empathize and sympathize with individuals going through struggles and try and get them the help they need. So we'll go on to the next slide. So as you can see, when we had COVID, the amount of individuals dealing with stress actually went up. And I have to make a very important point. Stress is not mental illness. And so, however, an abundance of stress can lead to mental illness. So just because, for example, someone has had many psychosocial stresses, for example, they have employment problems, they may have family problems, they may have problems, you know, financial problems, they may have multiple problems. It does not necessarily equal that problems equal depression. However, after someone's under a certain amount of stress for a prolonged amount of time, this can actually lead or predispose someone to become mentally ill. And as you can see, throughout the world, the amount of individuals who were impacted by COVID is quite high in terms of percentages, and the highest percentage that we see right here is 33% in the United States of adults experience stress and anxiety or sadness that was difficult to cope with alone during the pandemic. And are we out of the pandemic? It's hard to say, because we have so many different sort of COVID precautions in the hospital even now, and individuals are coming down with COVID even though they may not necessarily be hospitalized. And then also COVID also has long-term effects, referred to as long COVID, where apart from the stress that COVID may have had on society, there's also an additional stress that individuals who have suffered COVID sometimes have prolonged fatigue and also depression, and also a cloudiness and a fogging of thinking. So I think that it's good to be aware that we have situations of acute on chronic. So short-term stresses on long-term stresses that can produce outcomes of mental illness as well. If we could go on through the presentation. So I'll talk a little bit about the role of medication, but I'd like to pause now. Are there any questions? Sorry, I can't. I think you might be muted.
Yes, thank you so much. Yes, we do have a question from KR Rebuild. They're asking, but regarding when you were talking about the suicide, but if individuals will deny being suicidal, what can be done in cases like that?
Okay, that's a very good question. So I think a lot depends on the context. If you have one of the highest predictors of a future suicide attempt is a history of a suicide attempt. So if someone has attempted to end their life in the past, I think that even denials need to be investigated. Also, if somebody has one of the risk factors for suicide, are they intoxicated at the time or inebriated? Have they had a significant loss or a stress in their life? Have they been talking about not wanting to be around or ending their lives, or things would be much better without them? Have they been recently diagnosed, with depression? Are there firearms in the home? Do they which is very, and does the individual have access to this? Are there medications in the home that the individual could overdose on? Has the person become more isolated? So I think it's important that even if someone's denying that they're suicidal, that I think it's important that additional conversation and discussion happen with that person. And the discussion does not make somebody more suicidal. I think it's important that we have those frank discussions with individuals, and find out, are they future oriented? In other words, are they thinking about tomorrow? Are they still thinking about what they're going to do next week? Individuals who are about or contemplating suicide a lot of times are not thinking that far into the future. I think if someone doesn't know how to speak to that person, I think it's good to have them go in and speak to a mental health professional. And if they are not able to do that, at least go into a primary care setting or an urgent care. I think it's always better that way. Make it part of just the normal discussion. If it does have to be escalated, in Kern County, we have the mobile evaluation team, and it's referred to as the MET. And if someone has a mental health urgency or emergency, what will happen is that the MET team will be called and they'll come to the location and evaluate the person to see whether or not they're having suicidal ideation, suicidal intent, or a suicidal plan. If they have these but are still refusing care, then they can be put on what is referred to a 5150, which is an involuntary hold, which is a 72-hour hold for individuals who are either a danger to themselves, a danger to others, or what is referred to as gravely disabled. And gravely disabled is someone who's not able to provide for themselves food, shelter, or clothing, and refuses to accept food, shelter, or clothing and utilize them from a third party. So I don't know if that really helps with the answer.
No, very helpful, very helpful. Thank you.
Mhm. Any more questions there?
No.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. So I think this little sort of a diagram is just to kind of pinpoint that when we're talking about mental illness, we are talking about, this may be a little bit overgeneralized, but we are talking about a specific organ. We're talking about the brain. In the same way that, we would talk about, the heart in the same way we'd talk about the kidneys, in the same way we would talk about the liver, in the same way we would talk about the pancreas when we're talking about diabetes. We, in the same way we talk about the spleen when we're talking about immunity. When we're talking about mental illness, a lot of times we're talking about the brain. And so, just like there can be dysregulation and and um, and disease in these other organs, there can be dysregulation in the brain. And so, and again, this is pointing out that there is a physical sort of manifestation that accompanies mental illness. In other words, there are different theories, and it's being refined all the more. But for example, different levels of neurotransmitters, and we're talking about neurotransmitters, these chemicals in the brain that are involved in signaling, different levels of neurotransmitters, different levels of circulating hormones, um, can affect that brain chemistry, affect how the cells interact with each other, and bring about manifestations of mental illness. For example, it is known that when someone has exceedingly high levels of dopamine, um, then they can have hallucinations. When they have exceedingly low levels of serotonin, individuals can be suicidal, and individuals can have depression. And so there are actual causes that can be traced to the function of the brain that are related to mental illness. Again, and individuals who are born into families may be born into families where there may be a tendency to have low serotonin levels, which translates into that depression can run in families, or there may be or other mental illnesses are known to have a higher association when we look in families than between families. So, for example, there's a high association of bipolar disorder that runs in families. There's a high association of attention deficit hyperactivity that runs in families. And so it's important that when we are doing these evaluations, if somebody in the family has a mental illness, I think that puts that entire family on notice that their likelihood, due to being genetically related to that individual, that the mental illness might also become a reality with another family member. So, we'll continue on through the presentation. So as we proceed through the presentation, and there's just a whole lot of research, 16,000 plus abstracts, I'm sure a lot more, that are churned out. So we're not going to dive into abstracts right now. Just letting you know that a lot of research is happening, and we'll continue through the presentation. So, as mentioned before, when we're talking about the brain, we're looking at the brain as an overall structure. The interconnection between the brains happens between neurons, and at the end of the neurons, you have receptors, and as mentioned earlier, when you see the word congenital, it means inherited. And then also, mental illness can evolve over the course of time for an individual. So, in other words, if someone has depression, the depression that someone has, let's say at 20, if they have a depression again as they get older, it may not be the same type of depression. It might last longer. It may be more intense. So over the course of someone's lifetime, the mental illness can change. And over the course of the mental illness, it can either get worse or resolve. I think it's worth it saying that major depressive disorder, when somebody has it, it actually tends to run a course of about a year approximately. Even if it's untreated, it will resolve. But if it's treated, it will be a lot less intense, and the duration will be shorter, and the likelihood of it coming back will be less. Uh, so, so that's why it's important to treat some mental illnesses, for example, schizophrenia. And when I say schizophrenia, I mean someone who has they tend not to they're no longer engaging in conversations. They have a sort of a no change in facial expression. They're having hearing voices or seeing things. Um, they may have ideas of individuals being out to get them. And those are just some of the uh, cardinal signs of schizophrenia. Uh, can be a lifelong presentation. So, as mentioned earlier, uh, illness is not always or is not a choice. And why do I say not always and not a choice? Some mental illness can be brought on by substance use. A long term use of alcohol can lead to depression and also lead to problems with sleep and insomnia. However, even the whole thought of alcoholism itself is an illness. And it's not always as easy as saying, just say no. Uh, so, in some ways, we have to always have an empathy and a sympathy with individuals. Depression, individuals haven't made the choice to be depressed or anxious, and likewise. So, for the most part, illness absolutely is not a choice, and so we should not blame the individual who's ill. Uh, the whole idea that stress can lead to mental illness, but stress does not necessarily mean that someone will become mentally ill. And then also, depending on the mental illness, the age of onset may be different. For example, typically speaking, this attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, which happens in about 1 out of every 10 children, uh, happens very early. It tends to. You can have an adult onset, but typically early. Meanwhile, things like depression tend to happen later on in life, though you do have childhood depression. Um, some things may come and go, like bipolar disorder. And bipolar disorder is when someone has these periods of depression, but then they also have periods of mania. And so it can also vary with time. And then, of course, medication has a role. We'll continue on. So I'm going to uh, pause now and ask if there are any questions, and also ask what direction you'd like the presentation to go. We can go into a little bit about the background into medications and how they work, or we can look more generally at different types of mental illnesses and how we would address them.
Wonderful. I think that's a great suggestion to go into a more general. As we're short on time, we have about 10 more minutes left. So we do have some questions.
Yes.
So
good.
let's take Maria Thornay's question first here. She asked, does certain foods contribute to mental health?
So in some ways, I have to say yes and no. And what do I mean by that? So it's noted that individuals who go on very low carb diets or the Atkins diet can be more prone to low moods and and depression. But that's mainly because at the time when they're doing that, they're not getting a wide variety of wholesome, unrefined foods. In other words, they're not getting all of the necessary nutrients in their food that are important. And why is this important? Because we talked about neurotransmitters, and neurotransmitters are made out of the foods we eat. And so, if we don't eat a wide variety of foods, then that allow the body to make the neurotransmitters, then we're going to have problems. We're going to run low. And so, so I think when we say certain foods, I will not. I don't want to overgeneralize, but I'd say that if someone's eating a balanced diet, um, and when I say balanced diet, you can have a balanced vegan diet, and you can have an imbalanced vegan diet. You can have a balanced vegetarian diet and a non-balanced vegetarian diet. You can have a balanced, just a regular diet, and a non-balanced one. So I think it's a matter of having the right nutritional content rather than isolating and pointing at particular foods. However, certain individuals might notice that when they eat certain foods, they feel a certain way. And then I think we need to know our own bodies. And if that's the case, then avoid those foods that cause us to feel bad.
Excellent. Yes, I'm thinking about sugar as being one of those things that can increase anxiety. Is that right?
So this is how sugar kind of works. So someone takes in sugar, and when they take in sugar, their blood glucose goes up. So there tends to be a bit of a sugar rush. You know, the amount of sugar in the bloodstream is more than it was before. With that sugar rush, the body releases more insulin. Typically, the insulin is going to be released from the pancreas. So the insulin increases and it brings the sugar down. When it brings the sugar down, it tends to actually bring it down it can bring it down quite rapidly, and also it can bring it down almost to the point where it's slightly lower than it was before. And so it can cause someone to feel irritable, and they have these crashes, sugar highs and sugar lows. And that's why eating foods that release um, the and when I say sugar, I mean glucose into the system at a moderate and regulated way tends not to have these ups and downs in someone's blood sugar, and then someone tends not to get irritable as much, anxious as much. So sugar by itself, uh, I wouldn't say causes anxiety, but it's how that sugar is taken can lead to that. So I'd really recommend a large, a moderate amount of wholesome, unrefined foods. I think it's the refining of the sugar that causes it to have a sugar spike, then an insulin spike, then a sugar crash, and then this feeling of being irritable. Yeah.
Wow. So then we can say perhaps that if we're skipping breakfast and we're experiencing low sugar, our day already starts off with a somewhat of an irritable, anxious person, versus if we actually started with a full meal, balanced meal from breakfast, lunch, and dinner, we would be able to be a little bit more resilient, more handle our stress better.
So there's some things that, how can I say this? It's like, for example, when we talk about breakfast, we're talking about breaking the fast. And so I think it's only in recent history where we've actually thought that we need to eat like 3 times a day. I think Councils on Diets and Foods even says eating twice a day is good. And they suggest maybe having a breakfast and a lunch and maybe nothing in the evening. And so, in other words, the time between meals can extend for quite a while, and someone will do relatively well. So, how somebody has those two meals a day is can vary. So, someone not having breakfast could be considered to be, let's say, intermittent fasting. So, if they are continuing to fast, the the body itself can regulate and will get to a point where it's regulating its own blood sugar. And so instead of using take the blood sugars that's coming in, it will be using a hormone referred to as a glucagon to break down energy stores in the body, and your blood sugar will continue to be relatively okay, but you have to get used to it. I think the challenge comes when somebody has breakfast one day and then doesn't have it the next day and then has it. So the body doesn't even know what's happening. So if somebody has a habit of always never having breakfast, then that's not terrible because the body will actually be used to it and the blood sugar would be just normal. It'll be constant through sleep, constant through the day until they eat. And so however, if somebody has breakfast and a very sugary breakfast, and then it can cause the insulin spike and it can go down and it can be all over the place. So, as you mentioned, it's good to have a starting the day with a good meal, as mentioned in Counsels on Diets and Foods, that can produce a stable release of energy through the day. That would be the way to go. But there's no harm in, and I know that some people may not necessarily agree with it, but there's a lot of science behind you don't have to have breakfast to have as long as your other meals are balanced, nutritional, and you can get by with 2 meals a day quite well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for clearing that up. KR Rebill also asks, are there specific foods that should be avoided with mental illness?
Well, foods, I'd like to generalize and say substances. For example, someone has anxiety, I think they should stay away from caffeine, anything that has caffeine, because caffeine, for some people, causes a lot more jitteriness. So I definitely suggest staying away from things like that. If someone's taking certain medications, then maybe depending on the medications they're taking, for example, let's say someone's taking lithium as one of their medications, then varying the amount of salt that's in their diet can affect how the medication is absorbed. Again, I would not like to point out that food in and of itself causes mental illness. I just think it's a matter of eating as healthy as possible and maintaining an ideal weight. In fact, in addition to food, I would say having exercise is great for improving someone's mental health because it releases endorphins, which are the feel-good hormones. It helps us to regulate stress. It helps us to regulate our blood sugars, and it creates a feeling of overall well-being. So foods are important. Exercise is also important. Sleep is also very important. Having a structured sleep time, this will help with stress management, feelings of fatigue, and also will help curbing the appetite because individuals who are very, very tired may tend to eat to stay awake or eat to try and go to sleep, right? So I think that when we're looking at mental health, it doesn't exist outside of our whole health.
Thank you. Can you talk to us a little bit? How can we, for those of us who are church members, Christians, believe in Christ, how do we look at depression and anxiety? Do we look at it as a lack of faith? How do we see our spiritual lives in that context?
Okay, yeah, I might need to plug in because my battery is going down. Can you give me a second?
Sure, go ahead. No problem. Yes, wonderful. So thank you folks so much for tuning in. This has been a great presentation on mental health. Thank you for putting in your questions and your comments. We really appreciate it. We have Lady Buxton here who says, great talk. Thank you so much. Maria Thornay, thank you, Dr. Olango, for your great presentation. So that is really nice. We still have a few questions more to go. We want to do a shout out for Don L. live from Ohio. So it's great to hear from him. That's great. Thank you so much, Victoria, for tuning in.
Okay.
Yeah, we just have 2 more questions to go and we'll be
Okay.
good.
I mean, I'm ready, I suppose. Yeah. Hopefully the battery's going to
Very
last.
good.
Yeah.
Okay, good. We only have the 2 more questions there.
Yeah.
Here's one from Carrick Rebuild. What can be done to let an individual understand the need for medication and agree to take the medication? Accepting and taking medication most of the time is difficult for individuals with mental illness.
Yeah, that's a great question. And even I think there's a question that was before that about mental health and faith.
Yeah.
So I think I can combine these together. Sometimes when someone is diagnosed with a mental illness, there's a stigma. It's especially hard with children because no child wants to know that they're not like their friends. They can get teased, they can get bullied, they can get picked on. In fact, even in the workplace, if someone has a known mental illness, they may not even be treated the same as everyone else. Meanwhile, they can be very high functioning and do their jobs incredibly well. So I think when we start looking at mental illness as a change in brain function due to problems with the chemicals in the brain, and that the medications are helping to regulate those chemicals, just as someone who's been treated for diabetes takes insulin, just as when someone's who has congestive heart failure takes certain medications to help their heart function better. When we can look at it just from a medical point of view, I think it removes the stigma. I think also it's important that the individual feels supported when they're taking medications. Some of the mental illnesses have an up and a down, and it varies with time. And so someone can feel, I've taken the medication, now I feel great. That means I don't need the medication. Doesn't not necessarily mean that. It means the medication is working. So keep doing what you're doing. It's just like saying, I need to get to this part in town, let me get into the car. And you get into the car and it's taking you in that direction. And you say, well, now I'm moving in that direction, let me get out of the car. No, you need to stay in the car. The reason why you're going in that direction is because you're on the right track, And so I think it's important that when medications are taken, they are adjusted with the help of a healthcare provider. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, sir. I love that analogy. And our last question here is from Victoria. What would you recommend in areas of prevention among our youth in light of the rise in suicide rates?
Yeah, so one of the most important things that any person can do, especially youth that grow up in a family, is for there to be family time where individuals get a chance to talk with each other. There was a statistic that I saw a while ago that it says that parents only spend about 15 minutes a day with their children, with each child.
Oh.
Meanwhile, at school, the teachers spend a lot more time, but they don't really spend that individualized time with the child. I think it's important that we actually spend the time, and family worship can be a great opportunity where everyone's together and we ask about the day, how are you doing, what's going on. Spending that focused, intentional time, finding out what's going on with that youth, finding out whether or not they're being bullied, finding about whether or not they've had their heart broken, that happens, finding out whether or not, they're getting good grades or they're understanding what's going on in school. being that support for them, I think, is going to be so vital. And that way, we won't only be dealing with addressing into situations of suicide, but we'll also be speaking to wellness and that togetherness in the family.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Olango, for being with us, for giving us that wonderful presentation on mental health illness. The takeaways are definitely spend time with each other, find out about each other, how you're doing, check on each other, especially during these times where we've had so much isolation. We want to check on each other and make sure that we are hanging in there, that we're praying for each other and encouraging each other. Thank you so much, everyone. I think we have lost Dr. Olango here, but thank you, everyone, so much for hanging on with us. And we will see you next time.